What's up, guys? This is Dan Watson from learningcameras.com, and I wanted to give kind of another look at the RAW versus JPEG argument. And this one's going to be a lot different, and we're also going to post the files at learningcameras.com, so you'll be able to really compare for yourself. And I also want to compare the difference between Nikon and Canon with their JPEG and RAW processing, because honestly, these guys process files completely different. So I noticed that the Nikon JPEG files were completely different in comparison to the RAW files as Canon was doing it. So I want to give that to you as well. Now, I mean, people have built their entire business on shooting RAW, and other people have built their entire business on shooting JPEG. So I really want to give you something different and show you what I noticed when shooting in the field. And I will say that some things have changed. This is not the same as it was maybe 5-10 years ago when I was switching from from JPEG to RAW. And I can notice that the cameras are processing RAW files much better than they were before. The noise reduction is also much better. The in-camera abilities are much better than they were. And then when you take those files into post, they definitely have much more room and latitude to be able to edit even a JPEG file as they used to. However, one of the biggest issues with shooting RAW before was that these large file sizes, and you had to edit every photo, and the workflow was just a pain. But now with software like Lightroom and Aperture and things like that, it's a breeze to work through RAW files. It's not a pain anymore to have to edit those files at all for me. And you're talking terabyte hard drives for, for 50, 60 bucks. It just isn't a big deal anymore to be storing even these 25, 35 megabyte files as it was before. So the situations have changed quite a bit, which is why I wanted to give you this video. But let's take a look at the files. And let's start off with sharpness. And sharpness and noise reduction. And here's the reason why, because there's some big difference between Nikon and Canon on this one. Nikon definitely has some obvious sharpening, leading to sharper JPEG files than RAW files that are going on in the camera. Now, I did shoot these on the neutral setting to give myself a little bit more room in post. So the Canon, though, has a little bit more noise reduction that's going on in the processing file. Now, the Nikon file is from a D5300. The Canon is from a 5D Mark III. So, APS-C cameras and a full-frame camera. So we're not comparing the pictures exactly, but just the RAW versus the JPEG of those pictures. So with a little tweaking in Lightroom, though, I was definitely able to sharpen the Canon JPEG file as well as the Nikon RAW file to make them about equal, so I can make the JPEG look just like the RAW file without an issue on the sharpening side. But just keep that in mind, that when you're shooting JPEG in the Canon, it is not as sharp, so you might want to up the sharpness that the camera is doing using your picture settings. Now, when it comes to dynamic range, this was always one of the weaker points for me in shooting JPEG versus RAW, and I'll have to say that some things have changed a little bit. If you try to maximize these files, you can up the shadows and lower the highlights. And, I like shooting RAW for one reason, is I can get those highlights back and get those shadows back that I normally would have lost in the picture if I stuck with the file as a camera gives me. You can shoot HDR to do this, but I love being able to shoot just one file and not having to do an HDR for most things. I can capture enough highlights and shadows to make that work. Now, that said, let's take a look at these files, and the amount of detail I was actually impressed by both the Canon and the Nikon JPEG files. You're definitely able to push the shadows on these files a little bit more. Plenty of room for shadow boost compared to the RAW files. Now, when it comes to the highlights, that's where things started to get a little bit ugly. You maybe got about a half a stop into the highlights before things started falling apart, and you weren't able to get any more detail, and the detail that you were trying to get back from the highlights, it just didn't look that good. So RAW, it still is a little bit weaker on the RAW file on the highlights and the shadows, but you're able to get about a stop and a half before it really starts to lose information on that. So you definitely have much more advantage on the dynamic range. However, I was amazed that I was able to get that much push out of a JPEG shadow. And so the difference is not as much as it used to be. Now, white balance is one of the biggest reasons to shoot RAW, because you can completely change your white balance after the fact and not have to worry about getting everything accurate. Now, if you're shooting, let's say, a commercial job and you need color accuracy, definitely shoot RAW, because I don't know another way of making the camera JPEG file get as close as you can by altering those colors in post when you need to get very, very accurate colors. Now, for most of us, we don't need accurate colors for most of the things we're shooting. We just want to get the look that we're going for. Now, I was able to warm up and cool down the JPEG files pretty efficiently without starting to mess with the file. If you're starting to go kind of overkill on there, if you shoot something really blue and you want to warm it up completely or go for another look, you're not going to be able to do that in the JPEG file. With a RAW file, you can. So I will say this, if you're just minorly tweaking the temperature of your photo, you want it a little bit warmer, a little bit cooler. I didn't have an issue doing that with a JPEG file without seeing, and I didn't see any noticeable damage to the file when doing that. However, if you're looking at changing the overall look and tone of the photo, that's where things started to fall apart for me on the JPEG file, whereas the RAW file is able to preserve all of that color information. So I will say that I was a little bit taken back by the amount of power in the JPEG files. I definitely expected them to fall apart much quicker than they did, so I kind of had to change my mindset on that. I had to look at these files over and over again and really decide what I had to say on this, because I've been shooting RAW now for a long time, and I've definitely seen improvements on what the JPEG file is able to do. However, I still recommend shooting RAW, and the reason is because you are able to get that latitude out of the file, and two big reasons on that. You never know what the future is going to hold, and future software might allow us to pull even more information from those highlights and shadows than we're able to do right now, or take some other information that's preserved in that RAW file that's just not in a JPEG file. And you never know what the software is going to be able to do in the future. So it's always nice if you can, even if you're shooting RAW plus JPEG, and keeping those RAW files for the future so that you can edit maybe in the future when software becomes even better, or you learn how to use it a little bit more and the hard drives become even bigger. It would be nice to have that going forward. The other reason is this: if you're shooting some files RAW and some files JPEG, I don't know, if you're anything like me, you're going to forget that you shot your last project on JPEG, and you're going to forget to switch it back over to RAW when you're doing something important you want to shoot RAW. And I've done this before, and I've forgotten those file settings. So if you're going to be mixing it up and shooting both RAW and for one job and then shooting JPEG for another job, make sure that you have a pre-check list, and that is on your pre-check list, and you never go to a project without it. And you consult that pre-check list and go down and make sure that all of those settings are exactly what they should be for that project. And make sure to check that you're shooting either RAW or JPEG, whatever you want to shoot. So, you know, because of that and not having to worry about that, I definitely shoot RAW. I highly recommend it still if you can make that move. We're going to do some videos on how to make that switch from JPEG to RAW. It was a process for me. It took about 6 months. I at first shot RAW plus JPEG, and then eventually was able to give up JPEG completely. A lot of that's going to depend on the software you use and how you use it, and setting up a very, very good, efficient workflow to be able to batch export and be able to batch edit files, so that you're not spending hours and hours editing every file rather than using a JPEG. So, I mean, a RAW file is essentially the file as it was contained in the camera as the sensor captured it, and then the JPEG is applying some processing like contrast and sharpening and some other color editing to it, and making it into a file that looks what Canon thinks is good or what Nikon thinks is good. Once you have that processed file, it's so hard to get that information back if you want to change the look of that file, which is why shooting RAW is so important if you ever want to stylize your images. So because I never know what I'm going to use this image for, I never know what the future is going to hold, and I never want to forget that I have JPEG on or RAW on when I'm shooting an important project, I always recommend shooting RAW. And if you need any help with that, give me a ring. You can send us an email at Learning Cameras. Follow us on Twitter, and we'll definitely be able to help you out a little bit with making that transition. I hope to have some videos with our Behind the Glass series, a little bit more on how to teach you exactly how to do that for those of you who are struggling with JPEG to RAW. We're also going to be doing our RAW edits, so you're going to be able to practice on RAW files that I'm taking. So if you're not comfortable with using your own gear on that, feel free to download these files when we do a RAW edit contest, and edit those RAW files, get some practice. We'll show you what other people are doing and how I would edit that file. So take a look at those RAW edit videos, and that might help you out a little bit as well. So thanks for watching, and I hope to have some more on this in the future, so stay tuned.